Hello and welcome to our series exploring the untold stories of human history. I'm delighted to take you on a journey today into one of the most fascinating and challenging periods of our existence, the Ice Age. For most of human history, we were not farmers or city dwellers, but nomadic hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons and following the herds across vast, often frozen landscapes. The Ice Age, or more specifically, the Last Glacial period, stretched from approximately 115,000 to 11,700 years ago. During this time, our ancestors faced extreme environmental challenges that shaped every aspect of their existence, from the tools they created to the social structures they formed. They didn't just survive in these harsh conditions. In many ways, they thrived, developing technologies and cultural adaptations that laid the groundwork for everything we would become. Before agriculture revolutionized human society around 12,000 years ago, our ancestors lived very different lives from what most of us experience today. They were intimately connected to the natural world, reading the landscape like a book, understanding the behaviors of animals, and possessing knowledge of plants and natural materials that would astonish most modern humans. Today, we'll explore how these Ice Age nomads lived, their daily routines, their technological innovations, their spiritual beliefs, and the social structures that helped them endure in some of the harshest environments on Earth. We'll examine the archaeological evidence, from stone tools and artwork to remains of shelters and hearths, that gives us glimpses into their lives. We'll also look at how modern anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer societies can help us understand our ancient past. This isn't just a story about survival in extreme conditions. It's about the fundamental aspects of humanity that were forged during this period. Our adaptability, creativity, and social cooperation. It's about understanding where we came from and appreciating the ingenuity of our ancestors who navigated a world we can barely imagine. So join me as we step back in time to when glaciers covered vast portions of the Northern Hemisphere, when woolly mammoths and cave lions roamed the landscape, and when our ancestors carried everything they owned as they followed the rhythms of nature across the ancient world. The Ice Age environment. To understand the lives of Ice Age nomads, we must first understand the world they inhabited. The Last Glacial period was not a single uniform ice-covered world, but rather a complex mosaic of environments that changed over time and varied by region. At its peak, around 20,000 years ago, during what we call the Last Glacial Maximum, massive ice sheets covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and parts of Asia. These weren't just snowy landscapes, they were towering ice sheets, in some places several kilometers thick. The Laurentide ice sheet that covered most of Canada and the northern United States was so massive that it depressed the Earth's crust beneath it. But beyond these ice sheets lay a variety of environments. Much of Northern Europe, Asia, and portions of North America that weren't covered by glaciers consisted of what scientists call mammoth steppe, a cold, dry grassland ecosystem unlike anything that exists today. Think of the African savanna, but much colder and dominated by different plants and animals. These steppe environments were incredibly productive, supporting vast herds of herbivores like mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, horses, and reindeer. Further south were boreal forests and temperate woodlands, while the tropical regions remained relatively unchanged. Sea levels were much lower than today, as much as 120 meters lower at times, because so much water was locked up in the ice sheets. This exposed vast continental shelves, creating land bridges between places that are now separated by water. The most famous of these was Beringia, the land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska, but there were others connecting Britain to continental Europe, Australia to New Guinea, and many islands to mainland areas. The climate wasn't static throughout this period. There were significant fluctuations, with relatively warmer periods called interstadials interrupting the overall cold trend. Around 14,700 years ago, the climate began to warm significantly, though there was a return to cold conditions during the Younger Dryas period, from about 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, before the final warming that marked the beginning of our current epoch, the Holocene. The environmental challenges for humans living during this time were immense. Temperatures in many regions were 5 to 15 degrees Celsius colder than today. Winter storms would have been more severe, and the growing season in many areas much shorter. Resources were often scattered across vast territories, necessitating mobility and planning. Yet these challenges also presented opportunities. The mammoth steppe supported tremendous biomass in the form of large herbivores, providing hunting opportunities for those who developed the skills and technologies to exploit them. The cold climate preserved meat without the need for complex storage technologies, and the necessity of adapting to changing conditions likely selected for human traits like innovation, cooperation, and cultural transmission of knowledge. One particularly interesting aspect of the Ice Age environment was its effect on human physiology. Many populations living in these cold climates developed physical adaptations like shorter, more compact limbs and larger body mass to conserve heat. What anthropologists call Bergmann's and Allen's rules. We see this most clearly in Neanderthals, whose body proportions were adapted to conserve heat in the cold European climate, but similar adaptations occurred in some populations of Homo sapiens as well. The Ice Age also shaped human skin color. With less ultraviolet radiation in northern latitudes, lighter skin evolved to allow for sufficient vitamin D production. At the same time, populations in tropical and subtropical regions maintained darker skin as protection against intense UV radiation. These adaptations remind us that humans were not merely passive inhabitants of the Ice Age world. Our bodies themselves were shaped by its challenges. Understanding this environmental context is essential for appreciating the achievements of Ice Age nomads. They weren't just surviving in a hostile world. They were developing sophisticated cultural adaptations that allowed them to thrive in conditions that would overwhelm most modern humans. The archaeological record. Before we delve deeper into how Ice Age people lived, let's examine the evidence that forms the basis of our understanding. Unlike written history, which only extends back about 5,000 years, our knowledge of the Ice Age comes primarily from archaeological remains, the physical traces left behind by our ancestors. Stone tools are among the most abundant and durable archaeological remains from this period. From simple chopping tools to sophisticated blade technologies, these implements tell us about hunting techniques, food processing methods, and technological innovation. For instance, the appearance of specialized projectile points gives us insights into hunting strategies, while scrapers and awls tell us about hide processing and clothing manufacture. Stone tools of the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 50,000 to 12,000 years ago, show remarkable sophistication. Take the Solutrean points from Western Europe, dating to around 22,000 to 17,000 years ago. These exquisitely crafted leaf-shaped points required tremendous skill to produce, with some specimens showing flake removals of less than a millimeter in thickness. Such craftsmanship speaks not just to technological capability, but to the existence of specialized knowledge passed down through generations. Organic materials rarely survive from the Ice Age, but exceptional preservation conditions occasionally provide remarkable glimpses into aspects of life that would otherwise remain invisible. In the frozen permafrost of Siberia, archaeologists have found fragments of tailored clothing, including a 29,000-year-old ivory needle from the site of Denisova Cave that's so finely crafted it could pass for a modern implement. The remains of dwellings also offer insights into nomadic life. At sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, dating to around 27,000 years ago, archaeologists have found the imprints of structures built using mammoth bones as frames, covered with hides and insulated with grass and dirt. These would have provided shelter during harsh winter months. At Malta in Siberia, dating to about 24,000 years ago, similar semi-subterranean dwellings have been found, dug partially into the ground for better insulation. Hearths and the remains of meals tell us about diet and cooking techniques. Isotopic analysis of human bones reveals the proportion of animal versus plant foods in the diet, as well as whether protein came primarily from terrestrial or aquatic sources. At sites like Předmostí in the Czech Republic, enormous accumulations of mammoth bones tell us about specialized hunting techniques and possibly food storage strategies. Art and symbolic objects provide windows into the cognitive and spiritual world of Ice Age people. The cave paintings of sites like Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira, with their masterful depictions of animals, speak to keen observation skills and complex symbolic thinking. Figurines like the Venus statues found across Europe suggest spiritual beliefs possibly related to fertility and the female form. Personal ornaments like beads and pendants indicate status differentiation and possibly trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometers. Human remains themselves tell us about health, diet, and mobility. Isotope analysis of teeth can reveal whether an individual grew up in the same region where they died or moved from elsewhere. Examination of bones can show patterns of physical activity. Many Ice Age humans show evidence of tremendous limb strength and endurance walking capabilities that would put modern athletes to shame. Genetics has revolutionized our understanding of the Ice Age in recent decades. Ancient DNA extracted from human fossils has revealed population movements, mixing between different human groups, including Neanderthals and Denisovans, and genetic adaptations to environment and diet. For example, we now know that the ability to digest milk into adulthood, lactase persistence, evolved after the domestication of cattle and wasn't present in Ice Age populations. The discipline of experimental archaeology has also enhanced our understanding by testing hypotheses through practical experiments. Researchers have made and used replicas of Ice Age tools, constructed dwellings based on archaeological evidence, manufactured clothing using Ice Age techniques, and even lived in Ice Age conditions to better understand the practical challenges our ancestors faced. It's important to acknowledge the limitations of the archaeological record. Preservation biases mean we know more about some regions than others. Stone tools survive while wooden implements rarely do. Sites in caves and rock shelters are easier to discover than open-air camps. Nevertheless, by combining evidence from multiple sources and applying interdisciplinary approaches, archaeologists have built an increasingly detailed picture of Ice Age life. Making a living, hunting and gathering. How did Ice Age nomads sustain themselves in such challenging environments? Their subsistence strategies were sophisticated, diverse, and remarkably effective, allowing them to exploit a wide range of resources across different landscapes and seasons. hunting large game was a crucial survival strategy during the Ice Age. The mammoth steppe ecosystem supported an abundance of large herbivores, including mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, horses, reindeer, red deer, elk, and saiga antelope. Each required different hunting techniques. Archaeological evidence from sites across Eurasia and North America shows that Ice Age hunters were highly selective in their hunting strategies, targeting specific animals according to season, herd movements, and their own needs. Take the extraordinary site of Solutré in France, where the remains of an estimated 100,000 horses were discovered at the base of a limestone cliff. This accumulation, built up over thousands of years, suggests a sophisticated hunting technique where animals were driven toward the cliff in coordinated group hunts. Similarly, at sites like Předmostí in the Czech Republic, the remains of over 1,000 mammoths suggest specialized mammoth hunting, possibly using tactics like driving animals into marshes where they would become trapped. The weapons used for hunting evolved considerably during the Ice Age. Early technologies included thrusting spears, like the 300,000-year-old wooden spears found at Schöningen, Germany, which were likely used in close-quarter hunting. By around 50,000 years ago, humans had developed spear throwers or atlatls, which allowed hunters to launch projectiles with greater force and from a safer distance. Around 20,000 years ago in parts of Eurasia, we see evidence of bow and arrow technology, further revolutionizing hunting capabilities. But large game hunting, while often emphasized in popular accounts of the Ice Age, was just one part of a diverse subsistence strategy. Smaller animals like rabbits, hares, and game birds were important food sources as well. Sites in the Mediterranean region show intensive exploitation of small game, with specialized trapping technologies suggested by the remains. This focus on smaller prey intensified toward the end of the Ice Age in many regions, possibly reflecting overhunting of larger species or their extinction. Fishing and the exploitation of aquatic resources were also significant, particularly in coastal regions and along rivers. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, dating to around 70,000 years ago, fish bones and shellfish remains show sophisticated marine resource exploitation. In Japan, some of the earliest pottery in the world, dating to about 16,000 years ago, appears to have been used for cooking marine and freshwater resources. Fish hooks, harpoons, and net weights found at various sites demonstrate the technologies that made these activities possible. Plant foods, while less visible in the archaeological record due to preservation issues, were undoubtedly important components of Ice Age diets. Charred plant remains, grinding tools, and microscopic residues on stone tools provide evidence for the processing of wild grains, roots, tubers, nuts, and fruits. Dental calculus, the mineralized plaque on ancient teeth, has revealed starch grains and phytoliths that indicate consumption of plants including cattail roots, ferns, and grass seeds. The proportions of these different food sources varied greatly depending on region, season, and cultural preferences. In the far north, diets were heavily skewed toward animal foods due to the limited availability of plant resources. In more temperate regions, a mixed diet prevailed, while in tropical and subtropical areas, plant foods likely constituted a larger proportion of the diet. What's remarkable about Ice Age subsistence strategies was their flexibility and adaptability. Nomadic groups shifted their focus seasonally, tracking the availability of different resources across the landscape. They would aggregate in larger groups when resources were concentrated, perhaps during salmon runs or seasonal game migrations. and disperse into smaller family bands when resources were more scattered. Storage techniques allowed some groups to mitigate resource fluctuations. In permafrost regions, meat could be cached in the frozen ground for later consumption. Drying and smoking would have preserved meat and fish in other areas. Some sites show evidence of pit storage, which may have been used for nuts and other plant foods. These storage techniques, while not as extensive as those developed by later agricultural societies, nevertheless provided important buffers against lean times. The social organization of hunting and gathering was sophisticated. Ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherer societies suggest that while hunting large game was often primarily a male activity, women's gathering activities frequently provided the majority of calories consumed. Women's knowledge of plant resources, small game, and processing techniques was critical to group survival. Children participated from an early age, learning through observation and gradually taking on more responsibilities as they matured. Knowledge transmission was essential to these subsistence strategies. Young hunters needed to learn animal behavior, tracking skills, and weapon use. Gatherers needed extensive knowledge of plant properties, seasonal availability, and processing techniques. This ecological knowledge represented generations of accumulated wisdom, adapted to local conditions, and passed down through direct instruction and observation. The subsistence strategies of Ice Age nomads weren't just practical systems for obtaining calories. They shaped social relationships, technological development, and even spiritual beliefs. The interconnection between humans and the animals and plants they depended upon is reflected in the extraordinary cave art of the period, which predominantly depicts the very species that were crucial for survival. Technology and material culture. The technological achievements of Ice Age people are often underappreciated. Far from being primitive, their technologies were sophisticated adaptations to specific environmental challenges, refined over generations and produced with remarkable skill. Stone technology underwent significant evolution throughout the Ice Age. Early industries like the Mousterian, associated with Neanderthals but also early Homo sapiens, featured tools made by knocking flakes from pre-shaped cores. By the Upper Paleolithic period, beginning around 50,000 years ago, blade technologies became predominant in many regions. These involved striking long, parallel-sided flakes from specially prepared cores, a technique that maximized the cutting edge produced from a given amount of stone. The sophistication of these stoneworking traditions is exemplified by pressure flaking techniques seen in traditions like the Solutrean in Western Europe. This method, where force is applied with a pointed tool rather than through percussion, allowed for exceptional precision in shaping tools. Some Solutrean points are so thin and finely worked that they almost seem to defy the properties of stone as a material. Raw material procurement reveals complex knowledge systems and mobility patterns. High-quality stone like flint, obsidian, and jasper was often transported over considerable distances. Obsidian found at archaeological sites has been sourced to outcrops hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting either long-distance movement or exchange networks between groups. While stone tools receive the most archaeological attention due to their preservation, organic technologies were equally, if not more important. Bone, antler, ivory, and wood were crafted into a plethora of implements. Bone needles with eyes, found at sites like Denisova Cave in Siberia, dating to around 50,000 years ago, indicate sophisticated clothing manufacture. Antler was fashioned into harpoons, spear points, and spear throwers. Ivory was carved into everything from weapons to musical instruments and figurines. The site of Sunghir in Russia, dating to around 30,000 years ago, has yielded extraordinary ivory artifacts, including spears so straight and perfectly crafted that they would have required extensive knowledge of ivory properties and processing techniques. At the slightly later site of Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, excavators found kilns reaching temperatures of over 800 degrees Celsius, evidence of the first known fired ceramic technology, predating pottery by thousands of years. Fiber technologies, though rarely preserved, were undoubtedly important. The impression of cordage on a clay fragment from the site of Pavlov in the Czech Republic, dating to around 29,000 years ago, shows twisted plant fibers used to make string or rope. Ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherers highlight the importance of such technologies for making nets, snares, containers, and clothing. The crafting of clothing was essential for survival in cold environments. A remarkable discovery at Sungir was the remains of individuals buried wearing garments adorned with thousands of ivory beads, suggesting tailored clothing of considerable sophistication. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that making such beads would have required hundreds of hours of skilled labor, indicating the tremendous investment in clothing technology. Studies of Inuit and other circumpolar peoples provide insights into likely Ice Age clothing strategies. Multiple layers, careful design to prevent heat loss while allowing moisture to escape, and tailoring to permit freedom of movement would all have been essential features. The discovery of eyed needles and other sewing implements confirms the capability for such tailored clothing production during the Ice Age. Shelter technologies varied according to environmental conditions and available materials. In the mammoth steppe regions of Eastern Europe, mammoth bones were used as building materials for substantial dwellings. At the site of Mezhyrysh in Ukraine, dating to around 15,000 years ago, archaeologists discovered the remains of a dwelling constructed using 95 mammoth skulls arranged in a circle, with smaller bones used as a framework and likely covered with hides. These structures would have required considerable planning and collective effort to construct. In other regions, shelters were likely more ephemeral. Ethnographic studies of mobile hunter-gatherers show the use of easily transported hide coverings over simple frames, structures that leave minimal archaeological traces. In cave and rock shelter sites, evidence of constructed features like stone arrangements, post holes, and hearths shows how natural shelters were modified to enhance comfort and functionality. Transportation technologies included watercraft, though direct evidence is scarce due to preservation issues. The presence of humans in places like Australia, by at least 65,000 years ago, requiring sea crossings even during low sea level stands, indicates sophisticated maritime capabilities. Similarly, the settlement of the Americas, whether via the Beringia land bridge and then south along the coast, or directly across the Pacific, would have required advanced watercraft and navigation skills. On land, sledges may have been used in snow-covered regions, as suggested by ethnographic parallels. The domestication of dogs, which occurred during the Ice Age, with the earliest definitive evidence dating to around 16,000 years ago from the site of Bonn Oberkassel in Germany, may have been initially for hunting assistance, but dogs would later become important draft animals in northern regions. Fire technology was critical for survival, providing warmth, light, protection from predators, and means to cook food. Evidence of controlled fire use dates back hundreds of thousands of years, but Ice Age peoples developed sophisticated hearth constructions. At the site of Abri-Pator in France, dating to around 22,000 years ago, researchers found stone-lined hearths with evidence of repeated use and maintenance over time. Perhaps most remarkable about Ice Age technology is not just its sophistication, but its diversity and specificity to local conditions. Different groups developed technological solutions tailored to their particular environmental challenges. This diversity reflects both the adaptability of human cognition and the importance of cultural transmission, the passing down of specific technical knowledge from generation to generation. Unlike modern mass-produced items, each Ice Age technological creation was handcrafted by an individual with specific knowledge and skills. The quality of many surviving artifacts suggests that some individuals may have specialized in particular crafts, with skills cultivated over a lifetime of practice. These weren't just utilitarian implements. The aesthetic quality of many objects reveals the symbolic and social importance of technology in Ice Age societies. Social organization and community life. Understanding the social organization of Ice Age societies requires careful interpretation of archaeological evidence, supplemented by insights from anthropological studies of recent hunter-gatherer groups. While we must be cautious about drawing direct parallels across vast time periods, certain patterns emerge that give us glimpses into how these ancient communities functioned. The basic social unit was likely the band, a flexible group typically consisting of 20 to 30 individuals, often made up of several related families. These bands were not isolated entities, but part of larger regional networks comprising perhaps 150 to 500 individuals who shared language, marriage patterns, and cultural practices, what anthropologists sometimes call the tribe or regional group. Mobility shaped social organization in fundamental ways. Most Ice Age groups practiced what anthropologists call residential mobility, where the entire group moves camp as resources are depleted or seasonal conditions change. For example, a band might follow migrating herds, move to coastal areas for seasonal fishing, or relocate to access ripening plant foods. This mobility pattern discouraged the accumulation of material possessions, instead placing premium value on portable wealth and knowledge. It also fostered intimate knowledge of large territories and encouraged extensive social networks that could provide support during resource shortages or other crises. The distribution of archaeological sites gives us insights into seasonal movement patterns. In many regions, we find evidence of aggregation sites where larger groups gathered during periods of resource abundance. The site of Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic shows evidence of multiple hearths and dwellings, suggesting substantial gatherings of people, perhaps during seasonal mammoth hunts. These aggregation periods would have been socially important, providing opportunities for mate selection, ceremonial activities, and exchange of information and materials. During other seasons, groups likely dispersed into smaller bands to exploit more scattered resources. This fission-fusion pattern, coming together and splitting apart according to ecological conditions, is a hallmark of hunter-gatherer social organization and would have been particularly important during the Ice Age, when resource distribution was highly seasonal and patchy. How were these bands organized internally? Archaeological evidence suggests relatively egalitarian social structures, at least compared to later agricultural societies. The limited evidence for status differentiation in burials during most of the Ice Age indicates that social hierarchies, if they existed, were not rigid or hereditary. Leadership likely depended on context and personal qualities, rather than institutionalized power. That said, we should be careful not to romanticize these societies as perfectly equal. Even in the most egalitarian modern hunter-gatherer groups, there are status differences based on age, gender, skill, and personality. Some Ice Age burials do show evidence of differential treatment. At the site of Sunghir in Russia, 2 adolescents were buried with extraordinary grave goods, including thousands of ivory beads and other ornaments representing enormous labor investment. This suggests that some individuals, perhaps based on family connections or personal qualities, received special treatment. Gender roles almost certainly existed, though they may have been more flexible than in later agricultural societies. Cross-cultural studies of hunter-gatherers show that while there is typically a division of labor with men focusing more on hunting and women on gathering, these divisions are rarely rigid. Archaeological evidence from the Ice Age is limited, but isotope studies of human remains sometimes show mobility differences between males and females, suggesting gendered activity patterns. The nature of family structures and mating patterns is difficult to determine archaeologically. Genetic studies of modern populations suggest that throughout much of human prehistory, polygyny, one male mating with multiple females, may have been common, as evidenced by greater diversity in maternal, mitochondrial, DNA lineages than paternal, Y chromosome lineages. However, social marriage arrangements may have been more complex and varied than genetic patterns alone can reveal. Recent genetic evidence from a 34,000-year-old burial site at Sunghir, Russia, suggests that people deliberately sought mates from outside their immediate group, indicating awareness of the dangers of inbreeding. This practice of exogamy, marrying outside one's group, is common in hunter-gatherer societies and serves both biological and social functions, creating alliance networks between different bands. Age was likely a significant social dimension, with accumulated knowledge giving older individuals substantial influence. In societies without written records, the memories and experiences of elders represent irreplaceable cultural resources. At the same time, the physical demands of nomadic life may have limited the number of very elderly individuals, making their knowledge even more precious. Childhood in Ice Age societies would have been characterized by intensive learning through observation and gradually increasing participation in adult activities. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers show that children begin contributing to subsistence activities at an early age, while simultaneously engaging in play that develops essential skills. Archaeological evidence of miniature tools at some sites suggests that children were being taught technical skills from early ages. The social world extended beyond the living to include the dead. Intentional burial practices date back at least 100,000 years and become more elaborate during the Upper Paleolithic. These practices, which included positioning bodies in specific ways, including grave goods, and sometimes using red ochre, suggest belief systems concerning death and possibly an afterlife. They also indicate emotional connections to the deceased and social rituals surrounding death. Social cooperation was essential for survival. Many Ice Age subsistence activities, from large game hunting to dwelling construction, required collective effort and coordination. Archaeological evidence of food sharing is seen at hearth sites, where large animal remains show signs of butchery and distribution. The most plausible interpretation is that successful hunters shared their catches with the broader group, a pattern universal among modern hunter-gatherers. This sharing ethic would have been crucial during the environmental instability of the Ice Age, when resource availability could fluctuate dramatically. By sharing food and other resources, groups created social insurance systems that protected all members against the inevitable failures that any individual would experience. Communication networks likely extended far beyond immediate social groups. The distribution of similar artistic styles, technological innovations, and exotic materials across large geographic areas suggests extensive interaction between different bands and regional groups. These networks would have facilitated information exchange about environmental conditions, resource locations, and potential threats, as well as maintaining social ties that could be activated in times of need. The presence of personal ornaments like beads, pendants, and decorated clothing suggests that Ice Age people had ways of signaling identity, group membership, and perhaps individual accomplishments. These identity markers would have been important in navigating social relationships, particularly during larger gatherings where individuals from different bands came together. Conflict certainly existed, though its extent and nature are debated. Some human remains show evidence of violent trauma, and some rock art depicts what appear to be combat scenes. However, the frequency of conflict should not be overstated. The low population densities and ability to move away from conflicts likely limited the scale of violence compared to later periods. In summary, Ice Age social organization was characterized by flexibility, mobility, relatively flat hierarchies, and extensive networks of cooperation and exchange. These social adaptations were crucial survival mechanisms in the challenging and variable environments of the Ice Age, allowing human groups to collectively manage risk and adapt to changing conditions through the pooled knowledge and resources of the community. Art, symbolism, and spiritual life. Perhaps nothing captures the imagination about Ice Age people quite like their extraordinary artistic achievements. The cave paintings of Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira, with their dynamic animal figures rendered in ochre, charcoal, and manganese, represent some of humanity's most powerful artistic expressions. Yet these famous cave paintings are just one aspect of a rich symbolic world that Ice Age people created and inhabited. Cave art first appears in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago, with the earliest dated examples from Indonesia and Europe. The subjects are predominantly animals: horses, bison, mammoths, deer, and other species that were important to Ice Age subsistence. Human figures are relatively rare and often schematic rather than naturalistic. Abstract signs, including dots, lines, and geometric patterns, frequently accompany the figurative representations. The technical achievement of these paintings is remarkable. Artists used natural pigments like iron oxides, ochres, charcoal, and manganese dioxide, which they processed and mixed with binders to create paints with different properties. They employed sophisticated techniques like perspective, shading, and deliberate use of natural rock contours to create three-dimensional effects. Some paintings show evidence of preparation through scraping and smoothing the rock surface. The locations of cave paintings suggest they weren't casual decorations. Many are deep within cave systems, far from living areas, in chambers that would have been difficult to access and required artificial lighting. At Lascaux, researchers have found remains of stone lamps that burned animal fat to provide illumination. The effort required to create art in such challenging conditions suggests these weren't mere idle doodlings, but held significant meaning. What was the purpose of this cave art? Archaeologists have proposed numerous interpretations. The hunting magic hypothesis suggests the art was created to ensure successful hunts through sympathetic magic. The shamanism interpretation sees the art as representing visions experienced during trance states, with caves serving as portals to the spirit world. Others have proposed theories relating to initiation rites, teaching contexts, or territorial markers. The truth likely encompasses multiple functions, varying across time and space. What's clear is that these artistic traditions were maintained over thousands of years, indicating their deep cultural importance. At Chauvet Cave in France, Radiocarbon dating shows arc creation, spanning a period of about 10,000 years, suggesting knowledge transmission across hundreds of generations. Portable art forms were equally significant. Carved figurines of animals and humans have been found across Europe and Asia. The Venus figurines, female forms with exaggerated sexual characteristics, are perhaps the most famous, with examples found from France to Siberia, dating between 38,000 and 14,000 years ago. Their meaning remains debated, with interpretations ranging from fertility symbols to self-representations by female artists to embodiments of specific deities or spirits. Animal figurines show the same keen observation and technical skill seen in cave paintings. The 40,000-year-old Lion Man figure from Hohensteinstadel in Germany, carved from mammoth ivory and depicting a human body with a lion's head, may represent one of humanity's earliest examples of imagining beings that don't exist in the natural world. A cognitive leap of profound significance. Personal ornamentation was widespread during the Ice Age. Beads made from shells, ivory, bone and stone have been found at sites across Africa, Europe, Asia and Australia. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, perforated shell beads date to around 75,000 years ago, while in the Near East and Europe, collections of beads numbering in the thousands have been recovered from burial sites. These weren't merely decorative, but likely communicated information about identity, status, and group affiliation. Musical instruments provide another window into Ice Age spiritual and social life. Bone flutes dating to around 40,000 years ago have been found at sites in Germany, with the best preserved examples coming from Hohlfels Cave. These sophisticated instruments, typically made from vulture or swan wing bones, have multiple finger holes and can produce a range of notes, suggesting developed musical traditions. The social context of music making might have included ceremonies, storytelling, and entertainment. The treatment of the dead offers insights into beliefs about an afterlife or spiritual realm. Intentional burials become increasingly elaborate during the Upper Paleolithic. At the site of Sunghir in Russia, dating to about 34,000 years ago, two adolescents were buried head-to-head in a grave containing thousands of ivory beads, hundreds of fox teeth, and ivory spears. The labor investment represented by these grave goods is enormous, suggesting beliefs about the journey to or existence in an afterlife. Red ochre, an iron oxide with a rich red color, features prominently in both burials and other symbolic contexts. Bodies were sometimes covered with this pigment, which may have symbolized blood and life force. At some sites, ochre processing areas have been found, indicating systematic production of this symbolically charged material. What about organized religion as we understand it today? There's no clear evidence for codified religious systems or specialized religious practitioners during most of the Ice Age. Though this absence in the archaeological record doesn't preclude their existence, the complexity and consistency of symbolic expression across large areas suggest shared cosmologies and belief systems, even if they didn't have the institutional structures of later religions. Some researchers have identified possible evidence for shamanic practices, religious specialists who mediate between human and spirit worlds, often through altered states of consciousness. The Lion Man figurine mentioned earlier might represent such a transformation being, while some cave art may depict therianthropes, human-animal hybrid figures, that could represent shamans in transformed states. Certain buried individuals with unusual grave goods might have held special spiritual roles within their communities. The consciousness that produced this symbolic world was likely very different from our modern secular mindset. anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer groups suggest the worldviews in which the separation between human, animal, and spiritual realms is more permeable than in agricultural and industrial societies. In such animistic worldviews, animals and natural features may be seen as having personhood, intentionality, and spiritual power. The cave art's focus on animals may reflect not just their importance as food sources, but their significance in a cosmology where animals were spiritual beings with whom humans had complex reciprocal relationships. The detailed, respectful depiction of animals suggests a worldview in which humans saw themselves as one participant in a broader community of beings, rather than separate from or dominant over the natural world. Landscapes themselves were likely imbued with meaning and story. Distinctive natural features may have been seen as the dwelling places of spirits or the locations of mythical events. Some rock art sites are positioned at acoustically significant locations where sounds echo or resonate in unusual ways, suggesting multi-sensory ritual experiences. Toward the end of the Ice Age, with the transition to the Holocene around 11,700 years ago, we see the emergence of more complex ritual structures. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dating to around 11,000 years ago, features massive stone pillars decorated with animal reliefs, arranged in circular patterns. This site predates agriculture in the region and appears to have been a ritual center rather than a settlement, suggesting that complex ceremonial life may have preceded and perhaps motivated the transition to sedentary living rather than being a consequence of it. Throughout the Ice Age, symbolic expression wasn't separate from daily life, but integrated into practical technologies. Functional objects like spear throwers were often decorated with animal carvings, blurring the line between the utilitarian and the symbolic. A spear thrower from the site of Masdazil in France, dating to around 15,000 years ago, is carved in the shape of a mammoth, suggesting that even hunting equipment participated in the symbolic relationship between humans and prey animals. Handprints found at multiple cave sites offer a strikingly personal connection to Ice Age artists. At El Castillo in Spain, dating to at least 40,800 years ago, red ochre handprints were created by placing a hand against the cave wall and blowing or spitting pigment around it. These negative handprints, some of which appear to belong to children or adolescents, remind us that behind the sophisticated symbolic systems were individuals experiencing the fundamental human desire to leave a mark saying, "I was here." Recent discoveries continue to push back the dates for symbolic behavior. Geometric engravings on ochre pieces from Blombos Cave in South Africa date to 77,000 years ago, while shell beads from the same site are about 75,000 years old. Even more astonishing, a hashtag-like engraving on a rock flake from Blombos dates to 73,000 years ago, making it the earliest known drawing by a human hand. Neanderthals, too, engaged in symbolic practices. Evidence from sites like Bruniquel Cave in France, where Neanderthals arranged broken stalagmites into ring structures deep underground about 176,500 years ago, suggests complex behaviors that likely had symbolic meaning. Neanderthal sites have also yielded evidence of red ochre use, collection of unusual natural objects, and possible burial practices, challenging older views that symbolic thinking was unique to Homo sapiens. The study of Ice Age symbolism has been revolutionized by new scientific techniques. Microphotography and digital enhancement have revealed details in cave art invisible to the naked eye. 3D scanning and photogrammetry allow virtual preservation and study of sites. Dating methods including uranium-thorium dating of cave formations overlying art have pushed back chronologies and revealed much longer periods of artistic activity than previously thought. What insights does this rich symbolic world offer about Ice Age consciousness? It suggests that these societies invested substantial resources in activities that went beyond immediate survival needs. The transmission of artistic techniques and symbolic systems over thousands of years indicates strong cultural continuity and sophisticated teaching systems. The geographic spread of similar symbolic expressions suggests communication networks spanning vast areas. Most fundamentally, the symbolic achievements of Ice Age people remind us that they were fully modern humans in their cognitive capabilities. They weren't primitive precursors to civilization, but people with complex thoughts, emotions, and social lives, navigating their world through sophisticated cultural systems that we can only partially glimpse through the archaeological record. Adaptation and innovation. The shifting environments of the Ice Age presented human groups with constant challenges that required adaptive responses. Rather than seeing these challenges merely as hardships to be endured, we should recognize them as drivers of innovation that shaped human capabilities. Climate fluctuations were particularly dramatic during the last glacial period. While the overall trend was cold, there were significant oscillations, with relatively warmer interstadials interrupting the general glacial conditions. The Danskard-Oeschger events, rapid warming episodes followed by gradual cooling, could see regional temperatures rise by 8 to 15 degrees Celsius within just a few decades. For nomadic groups, whose survival depended on intimate knowledge of their environments, such rapid changes would have required substantial adaptive responses. Technological innovation was one key adaptive strategy. The shift from Mousterian to Aurignacian tool technologies around 40,000 years ago in Europe, for instance, saw the development of more specialized tools from blade-based industries. These included end scrapers for hide preparation, burins for working bone and antler, and backed blades that could be hafted as components in composite tools. This specialization allowed more efficient resource processing and the development of new capabilities. The invention of the spear thrower, or atlatl, around 30,000 years ago in Europe, represented a significant technological advance. By effectively lengthening the hunter's arm, this simple device increased the velocity of thrown spears, improving hunting efficacy and safety by allowing hunters to maintain greater distance from dangerous prey. Regional variations in spear thrower design show how groups adapted the basic technology to their specific needs and cultural preferences. Similar innovations appeared across the globe at different times, often in response to local conditions. The bow and arrow, one of humanity's most significant hunting technologies, appears in the archaeological record in Africa, possibly as early as 70,000 years ago, with secure evidence from sites like Sibutu Cave in South Africa, dating to around 60,000 years ago. In Europe, the technology appears much later, around 20,000 years ago, perhaps reflecting different hunting needs or cultural traditions. Clothing technology was another area of crucial innovation. The eyed needle, appearing around 40,000 years ago, revolutionized garment making by allowing the creation of tailored clothing that provided better insulation and freedom of movement than draped hides. The needle's invention likely involved multiple insights: the discovery that bone could be worked into fine points, the technique for drilling the eye, and the concept of pulling thread through multiple pieces to join them. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that making clothing using Ice Age technologies is remarkably effective. Replicas of Ice Age clothing made from animal hides processed with stone tools and sewn with sinew using bone needles, can provide insulation comparable to modern Arctic wear. The tailoring skills required suggest specialized knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship rather than casual learning. Housing adaptations show similar ingenuity. In regions where wood was scarce, Ice Age people developed techniques for constructing dwellings using mammoth bones as structural elements. At sites like Medzhirish in Ukraine, these dwellings could reach 6 meters in diameter, housing multiple families and providing shelter during harsh winter months. The collection and arrangement of these massive bones would have required collective effort and planning, demonstrating both social cooperation and engineering knowledge. Food processing innovations helped maximize the nutritional value of available resources. Grinding stones found at sites in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa show that plant foods were being processed to improve digestibility and nutrient availability. Cooking technologies, including various types of hearths and earth ovens, allowed certain foods to be detoxified and made more digestible, effectively expanding the range of edible resources. Storage solutions helped manage temporal fluctuations in resource availability. In permafrost regions, pits dug into the frozen ground could preserve meat for extended periods. In other areas, smoking, drying, and possibly fermentation would have extended the usable life of foods. These preservation techniques reduced vulnerability to seasonal scarcity and extreme weather events that might interrupt normal subsistence activities. Social adaptations were perhaps even more important than technological ones. The fission-fusion pattern of aggregation and dispersal allowed groups to adjust their size according to resource availability, with larger gatherings during abundance and smaller, more mobile groups during scarcity. This flexibility provided a crucial buffer against environmental unpredictability. Exchange networks facilitated access to materials and resources available only in specific locations. Archaeologists have traced the movement of distinctive raw materials like particular types of flint, obsidian, amber, and shells across hundreds of kilometers, indicating extensive trading relationships. These networks not only provided material goods, but also served as conduits for information exchange about environmental conditions, technological innovations, and potential threats or opportunities. Language development, while leaving no direct archaeological traces, was undoubtedly central to human adaptive success during the Ice Age. Complex hunting strategies, technological knowledge, environmental information, and social relationships all depended on sophisticated communication. The retention and transmission of cultural knowledge across generations, a distinctively human adaptation, relies fundamentally on language. Cognitive adaptations included the development of what archaeologists call external symbolic storage, the use of physical objects, images, and arrangements to record and communicate information. Cave paintings showing animal behavior may have served partly as teaching tools for young hunters. Collections of marks on bone and antler objects from sites across Europe have been interpreted by some researchers as notation systems, tracking lunar phases or other cyclical phenomena. Geographic knowledge was critical for mobile hunter-gatherers. Evidence from the distribution of exotic materials suggests that Ice Age people maintained mental maps covering territories of thousands of square kilometers, including awareness of resource locations, travel routes, and seasonal variations. This spatial cognition represents a sophisticated cognitive adaptation to mobility-based lifestyles. The end of the Ice Age around 11,700 years ago brought new adaptive challenges as environments transformed dramatically. Rising sea levels inundated coastal areas, changing woodland replaced open steppe environments in many regions, and many of the megafauna that had been crucial resources became extinct. Human groups responded with new subsistence strategies, including intensified exploitation of smaller game, increased focus on aquatic resources, and eventually, in some regions, the domestication of plants and animals that would lead to agricultural lifestyles. This post-glacial transition illustrates an important point about Ice Age adaptations. They weren't static solutions, but dynamic responses to changing conditions. The archaeological record shows constant refinement of technologies and subsistence strategies as environmental conditions shifted. This adaptability itself, the capacity to innovate and adjust cultural practices in response to new challenges, may be humanity's most significant evolutionary advantage. The diversity of adaptive strategies across different regions demonstrates that there was no single Ice Age life way, but rather multiple solutions to the challenges of survival in cold environments. Groups in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Northern Asia, North America, and other regions developed distinct cultural adaptations suited to their specific environmental contexts, while sharing certain fundamental features like mobility, technological innovation, and social flexibility. Perhaps most importantly, the adaptive success of Ice Age humans depended on cultural rather than biological evolution. While there were some biological adaptations to cold climates, like body proportions that conserved heat, the primary human response to environmental challenges was cultural. The development of tools, techniques, knowledge systems, and social arrangements that allowed survival in environments for which our species had no innate adaptations. This capacity for cultural adaptation remains humanity's greatest strength in facing environmental challenges. Migration and population expansion. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Ice Age is that it coincided with the global expansion of Homo sapiens. When the last glacial period began around 115,000 years ago, our species was largely restricted to Africa, with some presence in the Levant and possibly southern Arabia. By the time it ended 11,700 years ago, humans had colonized every continent except Antarctica and adapted to environments ranging from tropical rainforests to Arctic tundra. This expansion was not a simple linear process, but a complex series of migrations, local adaptations, population bottlenecks, and interactions with other hominin species. Recent archaeological discoveries and advances in ancient DNA analysis have revolutionized our understanding of this process, revealing a much more intricate story than previously imagined. The initial dispersal of Homo sapiens out of Africa likely occurred in multiple waves rather than a single event. Early evidence for Homo sapiens outside Africa comes from sites like Mislia Cave in Israel, dated to around 180,000 years ago, and Apodema in Greece, possibly dating to 210,000 years ago, though this early European presence appears not to have persisted. More sustained expansion began around 65,000 to 50,000 years ago, with humans spreading rapidly across southern Asia and reaching Australia by at least 65,000 years ago. This remarkable journey to Australia required multiple sea crossings, even during periods of lower sea levels when much of Southeast Asia was connected by land bridges. The shortest crossing would still have been at least 70 kilometers of open water, suggesting that these early migrants possessed watercraft and navigation skills. The settlement of Australia demonstrates that sophisticated maritime capabilities developed early in human prehistory, contrary to older views that such technologies emerged only recently. The colonization of Europe by Homo sapiens began around 45,000 years ago. though recent discoveries have pushed potential dates somewhat earlier. These migrants encountered Neanderthal populations who had inhabited Europe for hundreds of thousands of years and were well adapted to cold conditions. For several thousand years, the two species coexisted in Europe, with some regions showing alternating occupation by Neanderthals and Homo sapiens as climate conditions shifted. Genetic evidence reveals that these encounters included interbreeding. Most non-African populations today carry approximately 2% Neanderthal DNA, indicating limited but significant genetic exchange. Similarly, some Asian populations carry DNA from another hominin species, the Denisovans, who are known primarily from genetic material from a cave in Siberia and a few fragmentary fossils. Some populations in Melanesia have up to 6% Denisovan ancestry, suggesting more substantial interaction in that region. These genetic exchanges may have provided adaptive advantages. Some Neanderthal genes that persist in modern humans relate to immune function, suggesting they may have helped newcomers resist local diseases. Others affect skin and hair properties, potentially aiding adaptation to non-African environments with different UV radiation levels. This genetic evidence transforms our understanding of human evolution from a simple replacement model to a more complex picture of interaction and partial assimilation. The movement into northern Asia was well underway by 45,000 years ago, with sites in Siberia showing human occupation despite extremely cold conditions. The site of Yana RHS in northeastern Siberia, dated to around 31,000 years ago, has yielded stone tools, ivory implements, and animal remains indicating successful adaptation to Arctic environments. Ancient DNA from human remains at this site shows connections to populations that would later contribute to both Native American and European ancestry. The peopling of the Americas represents one of the most debated migrations in human prehistory. The traditional view held that the Americas were colonized around 13,000 years ago by people associated with the Clovis culture, who crossed from Siberia to Alaska via the Beringia land bridge exposed during low sea levels. However, multiple sites predating Clovis have now been documented, including Monteverde in Chile, dated to at least 14,500 years ago, and Chiquihuit Cave in Mexico, potentially as old as 30,000 years ago, though this remains contested. Genetic evidence indicates that the ancestors of Native Americans lived in isolation in Beringia for several thousand years before entering the Americas, a scenario called the Beringian standstill. During this period, they diverged genetically from Asian populations, but had not yet acquired the genetic signatures unique to later Native Americans. This isolation may have lasted from roughly 25,000 to 17,000 years ago, after which multiple waves of migration entered the Americas. The exact route of entry remains debated. During the Last Glacial Maximum, massive ice sheets covered much of northern North America, potentially blocking an interior route. Some researchers propose a coastal migration route, with people moving south along the Pacific coast using watercraft, though rising sea levels have obscured evidence that might confirm this hypothesis. Others suggest brief windows when an ice-free corridor between ice sheets may have been viable. The current evidence suggests multiple migrations using different routes at different times. Once humans entered the Americas, they spread remarkably quickly. Sites from Alaska to Chile dating to the late Pleistocene suggest that within a few thousand years, people had occupied environments from the Arctic to the southern temperate zones, demonstrating extraordinary adaptive capabilities. This global expansion was not continuously forward-moving. Climate deterioration sometimes forced population retreats or local extinctions. During the last glacial maximum, around 22,000 to 19,000 years ago, much of northern Europe appears to have been abandoned, with human populations retreating to southern refugia in Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans. Similarly, the northern latitudes of Asia saw population contractions during extreme cold periods. The genetic evidence for these contractions and expansions is seen in population bottlenecks, periods when genetic diversity was reduced as population sizes decreased, followed by founder effects as small groups expanded into new territories. Modern genetic patterns still reflect these ancient demographic events, with greater genetic diversity in African populations and sequential reductions in diversity along the pathways of migration into other continents. What drove these migrations? Climate change certainly played a role, alternately opening and closing corridors for movement and affecting resource availability. Population growth might have encouraged exploration of new territories. Cultural innovations that allowed adaptation to new environments enabled expansion into previously uninhabitable regions, and simple human curiosity, the desire to see what lies beyond the horizon, should not be discounted as a motivating factor. The Ice Age migrations shaped human genetic and cultural diversity in profound ways. As groups adapted to diverse environments, they developed distinct cultural traditions reflected in their technologies, subsistence strategies, social organizations, and symbolic expressions. The creative explosion seen in the archaeological record of the Upper Paleolithic, with its flourishing of art, personal ornamentation, and technological innovation, coincided with this period of global expansion and adaptation to new environments. Despite this diversification, the archaeological record shows remarkable commonalities across far-flung regions. Similar technological solutions often emerged independently in different areas, and artistic traditions show recurring themes and techniques despite geographic separation. These parallels remind us of the shared cognitive capabilities and cultural foundations that united Ice Age humans across their expanding global range. The legacies of these Ice Age migrations persist in modern human populations. Genetic studies can trace the movements of ancient populations through their modern descendants. Cultural adaptations developed during the Ice Age, technologies, social structures, and knowledge systems formed the foundation for all subsequent human societies. And the remarkable adaptive flexibility demonstrated during this period remains a defining characteristic of our species. The end of the Ice Age, transition to the Holocene. Around 19,000 years ago, the Earth began warming as it emerged from the last glacial maximum. This warming wasn't steady, but punctuated by climatic oscillations, including a dramatic return to cold conditions during the Younger Dryas period from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. By about 11,700 years before present, the planet had transitioned into the current interglacial period, the Holocene, marking the end of the Pleistocene epoch and the Ice Age that had shaped human evolution and cultural development for over 100,000 years. This climatic transition had profound effects on global environments. Massive ice sheets that had covered much of North America and Northern Europe began retreating, eventually disappearing entirely, except in Greenland and Antarctica. Sea levels rose as this ice melted, inundating coastal areas and creating modern coastlines. In many regions, open tundra and steppe environments were replaced by forests as warmer, wetter conditions allowed tree species to expand their ranges northward. For human populations, these environmental changes presented both challenges and opportunities. traditional hunting grounds transformed as habitats changed, and animal populations shifted their ranges or declined. Rising seas submerged coastal areas that had been important settlement zones, forcing relocation. But new environments also offered different resources, and warming conditions made some previously marginal areas more habitable. Many of the megafauna species that had been crucial resources during the Ice Age became extinct during this transition. In North America, approximately 37 genera of large mammals disappeared, including mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American horses, and saber-toothed cats. Similar extinction events occurred in South America, Australia, and to a lesser extent, Eurasia. The causes of these extinctions remain debated. Climate change certainly played a role, disrupting ecosystems and reducing suitable habitat for cold-adapted species. Human hunting pressure may have been a significant factor in some regions, particularly for isolated populations like those on islands. Most researchers now favor a combination of climate change, human impact, and ecological cascade effects, with different factors predominating in different regions. How did human societies respond to these dramatic environmental changes? Archaeological evidence shows a range of adaptive strategies. In many regions, subsistence practices shifted toward broader resource bases, including greater emphasis on plant foods, smaller game animals, and aquatic resources like fish and shellfish. New technologies developed to exploit these resources efficiently, including fishing gear, trapping devices, and processing tools for plant materials. In the Fertile Crescent of Southwest Asia, some communities began intensifying their relationship with certain plant species, particularly wild cereals like wheat and barley. By around 11,500 years ago, evidence suggests the beginnings of intentional cultivation, marking the early stages of agriculture. Similar processes unfolded independently in other regions. Rice cultivation began in China around 9,000 years ago, while maize domestication in Mesoamerica dates to roughly the same period. The development of agriculture represents one of the most significant transitions in human history, fundamentally altering the relationship between humans and their environment. Rather than adapting to natural ecosystems, agricultural societies began transforming landscapes to maximize production of specific resources. This transformation would eventually lead to permanent settlement, population growth, increasing social complexity, and ultimately the emergence of urban civilizations. However, we should avoid seeing this transition as universal or inevitable. Many societies maintain hunter-gatherer lifestyles long after the Ice Age ended, particularly in environments less suitable for early farming or where wild resources remained abundant. In parts of Europe, foraging communities persisted alongside early farming societies for thousands of years. In North America, agriculture developed in some regions, while others maintained hunting and gathering traditions until recent centuries. Even among societies that adopted agriculture, the process was gradual and varied. Many practiced mixed economies, combining cultivation with hunting, gathering, and fishing. Mobility remained important for many early farming communities, with seasonal movements between different resource zones. The sharp distinction between hunter-gatherers and farmers that appears in many textbooks oversimplifies what was actually a complex spectrum of subsistence strategies. The end of the Ice Age also saw significant cultural changes reflected in symbolic expression. The cave painting tradition that had flourished in Europe during the Upper Paleolithic largely disappeared, replaced by different artistic forms including painted pebbles and increasingly schematic representations. New symbolic systems emerged in many regions. possibly reflecting changing worldviews as environments and lifeways transformed. Settlement patterns shifted as well. Throughout much of the Ice Age, human groups had typically lived in small, mobile bands, though some regions show evidence of more substantial settlements during particular periods. As the Holocene progressed, more permanent settlements became common in many areas, reflected archaeologically in more substantial dwelling structures, storage facilities, and accumulations of debris, indicating longer-term occupation. This shift towards sedentism, living in fixed locations, occurred even among some groups that maintained primarily hunting and gathering economies. At sites like Lepenski Vir, in the Danube Gorges, Serbia, and various shell-midden sites along coastlines worldwide, hunter-gatherer communities established long-term settlements based on particularly rich and reliable local resources, challenging the assumption that sedentism required agriculture. Changes in social organization accompanied these transitions in many regions. More permanent settlements allowed accumulation of possessions, potentially increasing inequality as some individuals or families acquired more resources than others. Storage technologies became more sophisticated, allowing surplus resources to be saved for lean periods, but also potentially creating differential access to these surpluses. Evidence for status differentiation becomes more apparent in burial practices in many regions during the early Holocene. Population dynamics also shifted. While evidence suggests population growth rates were already increasing in some regions during the late Pleistocene, the adoption of food production and increasing sedentism in the early Holocene facilitated more substantial population expansion in many areas. This growth created new social challenges requiring development of mechanisms for conflict resolution, resource allocation, and decision-making in larger, more densely settled communities. The transition from the Ice Age to the Holocene was not experienced uniformly across the globe. In some regions, the change was dramatic. Landscapes transformed within human lifespans, requiring rapid adaptation. In others, particularly in tropical areas less affected by glaciation, environmental changes were more subtle. Similarly, human responses varied according to local conditions, existing cultural traditions, and available resources. Despite these variations, the ending of the Ice Age represents a fundamental transition point in human history. The environmental conditions that had shaped human evolution and cultural development for tens of thousands of years gave way to the warmer, more stable climate of the Holocene that has characterized the entire span of recorded history and the development of complex civilizations. The legacy of Ice Age adaptations persisted, however, in fundamental aspects of human cognition, social behavior, and cultural practices. The capacity for innovation, the importance of social cooperation, the ability to transmit knowledge across generations, and the cognitive flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. All traits that had been essential for Ice Age survival remained central to human success in the post-glacial world. Legacy and relevance today. The Ice Age may seem impossibly remote from our modern world of cities, digital technology, and global connectivity. Yet the legacy of this formative period continues to shape us in profound ways, from our genetic makeup to our cognitive capabilities, social behaviors, and relationship with the natural world. Understanding this legacy offers valuable perspectives on contemporary challenges and what it means to be human. Genetically, we carry the imprint of Ice Age adaptations and migrations. The distribution of blood types, disease resistances, and metabolic traits in modern populations reflects ancestral adaptations to different environments and diets. The capacity to digest milk into adulthood lactase persistence, evolved after the domestication of cattle, but varies according to the ancestry of populations, with higher frequencies in groups with long histories of dairying. Similarly, adaptations to high-altitude environments, extreme cold, and different dietary regimes that evolved during or after the Ice Age continue to influence health outcomes in different populations. The genetic legacy includes the traces of ancient interbreeding with other hominin species. The Neanderthal DNA present in most non-African populations affects traits ranging from immune function to skin and hair properties, susceptibility to certain diseases, and possibly even behavioral characteristics. Far from being completely replaced, these ancient relatives contributed to our modern genetic makeup in ways we're only beginning to understand. Cognitively, our brains evolved in contexts very different from modern environments. The neural architecture that solved problems of hunting, gathering, navigation without maps, social cooperation in small groups, and transmission of complex knowledge through oral traditions now confronts challenges involving digital information overload, anonymous online interactions, and environmental threats operating at global scales. Some researchers argue that modern psychological conditions like attention deficit disorder, anxiety, and depression may partly reflect mismatches between evolved cognitive tendencies and contemporary environments. Conversely, capabilities that evolved for Ice Age survival continue to serve us well. The human capacity for innovation, adaptation to changing conditions, long-term planning, and creative problem-solving all have roots in the challenges our ancestors faced. Perhaps most importantly, the social cooperation that was essential for Ice Age survival, sharing resources, collective childcare, division of labor, and knowledge transmission, remains fundamental to human success today, even as it operates in very different contexts. Our relationship with the natural world still bears the imprint of Ice Age experiences. Research in environmental psychology suggests that humans tend to prefer landscapes resembling the savannas, where much of our evolution occurred. Open spaces with scattered trees, water features, and vantage points. Studies of attention restoration show that natural environments reduce stress and cognitive fatigue more effectively than built environments, potentially reflecting deep evolutionary adaptations. At the same time, certain modern environmental challenges may stem from cognitive adaptations that served our ancestors well, but lead to maladaptive outcomes in contemporary contexts. The tendency to prioritize immediate threats over long-term risks, to value visible resources over invisible ones, and to respond more strongly to intentional than impersonal harms may impede effective responses to gradual environmental degradation and climate change. The transition from Ice Age nomadism to settled agricultural life continues to influence modern societies in surprising ways. Some researchers argue that many contemporary health issues, from obesity to cardiovascular disease, reflect mismatches between bodies adapted for active hunter-gatherer lifestyles and modern sedentary living. The paleo diet movement, whatever its scientific merits, represents an attempt to address this perceived mismatch by emulating ancestral dietary patterns. More profoundly, the relatively recent transition to agriculture and settled life means that many of our social institutions and cultural practices are adaptations to conditions very different from those in which our species evolved. Private property, inheritance systems, gender roles, political hierarchies, and religious structures all developed primarily after the Ice Age ended and settled agricultural societies emerged. This doesn't make such institutions unnatural, but it highlights their historical contingency rather than their inevitability. archaeological evidence from the Ice Age challenges certain myths about human nature and society. The relatively egalitarian social structures of most hunter-gatherer groups, with their emphasis on sharing and cooperation rather than individual accumulation, contradict claims that extreme inequality is an inevitable feature of human societies. Similarly, evidence for care of disabled and elderly individuals in many Ice Age contexts challenges social Darwinist narratives about the survival of only the fittest. The study of Ice Age societies also offers perspectives on human resilience and adaptation to climate change. Our ancestors survived and thrived through climate fluctuations as dramatic as any we face today, though with much smaller populations and without the benefit of modern science and technology. Their successful adaptations depended on mobility, flexibility in resource use, strong social networks, and transmission of environmental knowledge across generations. Strategies that may have continuing relevance even in very different contexts. At the same time, we should be cautious about oversimplified narratives, drawing direct parallels between Ice Age climate adaptations and contemporary challenges. Our ancestors faced gradual changes occurring over generations, allowing cultural adaptation through trial and error, whereas modern climate change is occurring at unprecedented rates. They could move to new territories as conditions changed, whereas modern population densities and political boundaries constrain such mobility. And the scale of contemporary human impact on planetary systems has no parallel in the Ice Age world. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Ice Age is the reminder it provides of human adaptability and resilience. Our species has survived dramatic climate changes, confronted novel environments, overcome resource scarcity, and maintained cultural continuity through extraordinarily challenging conditions. This doesn't guarantee successful adaptation to future challenges, but it does suggest that the capacity for creative responses to environmental change lies deep in our evolutionary and cultural history. The Ice Age also reminds us of our fundamental connection to the natural world. Despite all our technological achievements, we remain biological organisms shaped by evolutionary processes and dependent on functioning ecosystems. The sophisticated ecological knowledge developed by Ice Age societies, their intimate understanding of animal behavior, plant properties, and environmental patterns suggests alternative modes of relating to nature that might inform more sustainable approaches today. In educational contexts, the study of Ice Age societies offers valuable perspectives on human diversity and cultural adaptation. It challenges progressivist narratives that treat hunter-gatherer societies as primitive, rather than as sophisticated adaptations to particular environmental conditions. It demonstrates that complex symbolic thinking, artistic expression, and technological innovation long predated urban civilization. And it highlights the diversity of successful human adaptations across different environments and historical contexts. Finally, the Ice Age offers a valuable extension of our temporal perspective. Modern concerns often focus on timeframes of days, months, or at most years. Political systems operate on electoral cycles of a few years, while economic systems prioritize quarterly returns. The Ice Age reminds us that human history unfolds over much longer timescales, with changes that may seem imperceptible within a single lifetime transforming societies over generations. This longer view may be essential for addressing contemporary challenges like climate change, biodiversity loss, and sustainable resource use, which operate on timescales beyond individual experience. Conclusion. As we conclude this exploration of Ice Age nomads, it's worth reflecting on what their story reveals about humanity's journey and the foundations of our modern existence. These ancestors, separated from us by millennia, yet connected through unbroken chains of cultural and genetic inheritance, navigated a world we can barely imagine. Their successes and adaptations created the platform from which all subsequent human achievements would develop. The archaeological record reveals societies of remarkable sophistication and resilience. Ice Age people weren't simply struggling for bare survival, but creating complex cultural systems that included art, music, personal adornment, and symbolic communication. They developed technologies precisely adapted to their environments, from specialized hunting implements to tailored clothing and efficient shelters. They established social systems that balanced individual autonomy with the cooperation essential for survival in challenging conditions. Perhaps most impressively, they maintained cultural continuity across vast time periods despite the absence of writing. Knowledge was passed down through generations via oral traditions, apprenticeship, and direct observation, preserving crucial survival information while allowing adaptation to changing conditions. The persistence of artistic traditions like cave painting over thousands of years demonstrates the effectiveness of these transmission systems. The transition from the Ice Age to the Holocene represents one of the most significant environmental shifts in human experience. The warming climate, retreating glaciers, rising seas, and transforming ecosystems required substantial adaptive responses. Some societies developed what would become agriculture, setting the stage for the emergence of settled villages, towns, and eventually cities and states. Others maintained mobile hunter-gatherer lifeways, adapting their traditional practices to new environmental conditions and continuing to thrive for thousands of years. This diversity of adaptive responses reminds us that there is no single path of human development, no inevitable progression from hunting and gathering to farming to urban civilization. Different environments favored different solutions, and human cultural creativity found multiple successful strategies for living within particular ecological contexts. The ethnocentric view that treats agricultural and urban societies as inherently more advanced than nomadic ones fails to recognize the sophisticated nature of hunter-gatherer adaptations. The study of Ice Age societies also challenges the artificial boundaries between natural and human history. Our ancestors weren't separate from the ecosystems they inhabited, but integral components of them, shaping and being shaped by their environments in complex feedback loops. Their ecological knowledge wasn't abstract or theoretical, but embodied and practical, developed through generations of direct interaction with the living world. Methodology matters in how we interpret this distant past. Archaeology has moved beyond viewing material remains as mere curiosities to treating them as windows into complex cultural systems. Interdisciplinary approaches combining archaeological excavation, ethnographic comparison, experimental recreation, genetic analysis, and environmental reconstruction provide increasingly nuanced understandings of ancient lifeways. Indigenous knowledge and perspectives offer valuable insights that complement scientific approaches, particularly regarding human-environment relationships and the social context of traditional technologies. Looking ahead, the field continues to evolve. New dating techniques push back chronologies and reveal surprising connections between different regions. Ancient DNA analysis transforms our understanding of population movements and interactions. Digital technologies enable virtual preservation and analysis of fragile sites. And ongoing archaeological discoveries regularly challenge established narratives about the past. For us today, the Ice Age represents not just an academic subject, but a vital part of our human story. Understanding how our ancestors adapted to extreme environmental challenges, maintained social cohesion through cooperative systems, and transmitted knowledge across countless generations provides perspectives that may inform our responses to contemporary challenges. Their story reminds us of the depth of human resilience, the power of cultural adaptation, and our fundamental connection to the natural world. These ancient nomads, moving across landscapes with their minimal material possessions, yet rich cultural knowledge, understood something that modern settled societies sometimes forget: that humanity's greatest resources aren't objects or structures, but adaptability, cooperation, and the creative spirit that finds solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems. In that sense, the legacy of Ice Age nomads lives on not just in our genes and artifacts, but in the fundamental capacities that make us human.